Imagine a world where kings were as wild as the creatures they hunted, where churches were empty, and where the most respected scholars fought over a book that some called dangerous and others saw as a masterpiece. This was the world of the 14th and 15th centuries, a time of chaos and change, where the old ways were crumbling and new ideas were emerging. In this world, a young king named Wenceslas IV ruled over the Holy Roman Empire, but his reign was far from peaceful. Wenceslas was a man of many contradictions. He was educated and literate, but he lacked the strength to govern. He was charming and handsome, but he was also cruel and unpredictable. His story is a window into a time when faith, power, and human nature were all in flux. Wenceslas IV became King of Bohemia, and later Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 1378. He was only 18 years old, and despite being well educated and trained in government by his father, Charles IV, he was ill-equipped to handle the chaotic world he inherited. The Holy Roman Empire was a vast and fragmented realm, with numerous principalities, powerful noble families, and independent towns that often acted like small kingdoms. Wenceslas's rule was marked by constant conflict and internal strife, and his personal behavior only added to the chaos. Wenceslas was known for his wild and unpredictable nature. He loved hunting and would often spend months at a time in the forests, neglecting his duties as king. He was a heavy drinker, and his temper was notorious. He would go on rampages at night, breaking into the homes of citizens and committing acts of violence. Some stories even claim that he locked his own wife in a brothel and roasted a cook who served him a burned meal. These tales, while likely exaggerated, reflect the deep animosity and fear that many people felt toward him. Wenceslas's relationship with the church was particularly tumultuous. The church was a powerful institution, and the struggle between secular and religious authority was a constant source of conflict. In 1393, Wenceslas had a violent confrontation with the church over the appointment of an abbot. The Archbishop of Prague, who supported a candidate different from Wenceslas's choice, was arrested along with other church officials. Wenceslas reportedly tortured these men to extract a confession of their supposed crimes. When one of them, John of Pommok, was too weak to sign an oath of silence, Wenceslas had him thrown into the Moldau River to drown. John of Pommok was later canonized as a martyr, and his story became a symbol of the church's resistance to secular tyranny. Wenceslas's reign was marked by a series of failures and scandals. He was deposed as emperor in 1400, but he remained King of Bohemia until his death in 1419. His legacy was one of chaos and decline, and he became a symbol of the failures of the old order. The world he lived in was changing, and the old systems of power and authority were no longer sufficient to maintain order. This was a time when new ideas were beginning to challenge the established order, and the church itself was facing a crisis of faith and authority. The church was not immune to the chaos of the time. The Great Schism, which began in 1378, saw the papacy divided between two rival claimants, one in Rome and one in Avignon. This split not only weakened the church's authority, but also exposed its corruption and greed. Popes like Boniface IX in Rome and Clement VII in Avignon were more concerned with accumulating wealth and power than with spiritual leadership. They sold church offices, took loans from usurers, and extracted voluntary taxes from the clergy. The church's moral authority was in decline, and this created a crisis of faith among the people. At the same time, new movements were emerging that challenged the church's authority and offered a different path to spiritual fulfillment. One of these movements was the Brethren of the Common Life, founded by Gerard Groot in the Netherlands. Groot, a former worldly scholar and priest, experienced a spiritual awakening and dedicated his life to spreading a message of devotion and community. The Brethren lived in communal houses, focused on personal piety, and emphasized the importance of good works and charity. They were not a monastic order, but rather a lay movement that sought to bring the teachings of Christ into everyday life. The Brethren of the Common Life were part of a broader movement of lay piety that was gaining momentum in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. People were seeking a more direct and personal connection to God, one that did not rely on the rituals and hierarchies of the church. This movement was a response to the perceived corruption and irrelevance of the church, and it laid the groundwork for the Reformation that would come a century later. Another challenge to the Church came from the work of scholars like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia. Wycliffe was a theologian who criticized the Church's wealth and corruption, and argued that the Bible should be accessible to all people. His ideas spread across Europe and influenced a generation of reformers. Jan Hus, a Czech priest and philosopher, built on Wycliffe's ideas and became a prominent critic of the Church. Hus was eventually burned at the stake as a heretic in 1415, but his followers, known as the Hussites, continued to resist the Church's authority and sparked a series of rebellions in Bohemia. The Hussite movement was a significant challenge to the established order, and it reflected a growing dissatisfaction with the Church's leadership. The Hussites rejected the authority of the Pope and the Church hierarchy, and they called for a return to the simple teachings of Christ. Their movement was not just a religious one, but also a political and social one, as it challenged the power of the nobility and the Church. The Hussite Wars, which lasted from 1419 to 1434, were a violent and bloody conflict that reshaped the political landscape of Bohemia and had far-reaching consequences for the rest of Europe. The world of Wenceslas IV and the 14th-15th centuries was one of turmoil and change. Old systems of power and authority were being challenged, and new ideas were emerging. The Church, once the center of spiritual and political life, was facing a crisis of faith and authority. Lay movements like the Brethren of the Common Life and the Hussites offered alternatives to the established order, and they paved the way for the Reformation that would come a century later. In this world of chaos and change, the story of Wenceslas IV is a cautionary tale. He was a king who lacked the strength and vision to lead his people through a time of crisis. His reign was marked by violence, corruption, and failure, and he became a symbol of the decline of the old order. But his story also reflects the broader changes taking place in Europe, as people sought new ways to understand their world and their place in it. The 14th and 15th centuries were a time of transition, a time when the old ways were giving way to new ideas and new possibilities. The world was changing, and the legacy of that change would shape the future of Europe for centuries to come.